After the assassination of the Duke of Buckingham, a new court clique had to be organized. And this new clique consisted basically of three people plus, of course, King Charles himself. First was the Queen, Henrietta Maria. We've already commented on her. She had been somewhat alienated from the king by Buckingham, but after his death, she patched things up and she began to play again quite a prominent role in the leading group. Second in command, I would say, was a man by the name, we've come across him before, Sir Thomas Wentworth. You will perhaps remember that last time we came across him, he was one of the leading opponents of the king, a very capable man, a very good speaker, very intelligent, tactician and so on. Strong man also, strong-willed, who had been bought off by the king. The king and his agents were quite skillful at this. They would catch hold of a rebel. I think they still do this in Parliament to the present day, I believe. Any promising-looking, intelligent, strong-willed militant in Parliament would be immediately surrounded, to his great surprise, in the bar of the House of Commons these days, by the enemy, who would praise him and pat him on the back and buy him a drink and so on, and say how well he spoke. Didn't agree with everything. Surely he was a little bit exaggerated, but there you are, nobody's perfect. This kind of thing. Until gradually you get involved in dinners and other invitations. You move further up the scale until finally you're given certain rewards, invited to become a shareholder and so on, until eventually you get to meet the big man himself, which happened with Thomas Wentworth. And these people, of course, they're very good psychologists. They immediately understand when somebody is an egotist, and they flatter his ego. And what greater flattering could there be than to be ushered into the presence of the great man, of King Charles himself, who, probably to Wentworth's astonishment, offers him one of the plum jobs, one of the top jobs in this new dictatorship, because that's what it was. The 11-year tyranny was a dictatorship. No parliament, no democracy. The rule of a tiny clique led by the king. And he offered him a plum job. The president of the Council of York, no less. Well, that was quite a plum job. There was a lot of money to be gained from being put in virtually dictatorial charge of the whole of the north of England with its revenues and so on. So it didn't take Wentworth long to choose which side he was on. And once he joined the king, then from becoming an outspoken opponent of the king, he became an outspoken defender of the king and the monarchical cause until his death. And of course, his politics his choice eventually led to his death, but that's another story for a future episode. Thomas Wentworth. Subsequently, the king sent him to Ireland. I think it was in 1633 or 34, I can't remember. He was sent to Ireland, which was in a state of turbulence at the time. A lot of disorder and turbulence, which I haven't got time to deal with. We'll deal with it in a future episode. But he was sent to get Ireland under control, and above all, to get some money out of Ireland. Charles, you see, was still with difficulties economically. He wanted to raise cash. And this episode will deal with how he raised cash. Wentworth was quite successful. In fact, he was promoted to a new role. He became the Earl of Stafford, and that, of course, will be the way in which he will be referred to in future. He was the king's second-hand man, right-hand man, in effect. And he was so successful in Ireland at squeezing money out of the natives, all of them, rich and poor alike. He earned the nickname of, Black Tom Tyrant. Well, it tells you a little bit, tells you all you need to know about this gentleman. The next member of the clique is perhaps the most important of all, the most decisive. William Laud. At the time that we meet him first, he's the Archbishop of London, although he's risen quite. It's been a meteoric rise. He came from very humble origins, I think his father was a clothier in Reading, if I'm not mistaken. A humble background, same as Wolsey in the past, who was the son of a butcher. He rose to the dizzying heights, first of all, Archbishop of London, where his right-wing views, his pro-Catholic leanings and so on, earned him the plaudits of the Queen and the King. He became a close confidant of the King and Queen. And subsequently, in 1633 precisely, that was the date, when Strafford was being sent off to Ireland, he became the Archbishop of Canterbury, no less, the top man, the man in charge of the entire Church of England with all its thousands and thousands of ministers and bishops and properties and money and luxury and so on and so forth. He took over. And it was Laud that launched a series of fundamental reforms, with the full support of the King, of course, of the Church of England. He was very much a man in favour of the hierarchical system, a tyrannical hierarchy. In fact, you could say that he was responsible for transforming the Church of England into a mirror image of the dictatorship of the 11 years tyranny. You had the hierarchy of the secular wing under the control of the court clique and the king, and you had a parallel hierarchy, a very tyrannical hierarchy of the Church of England, which in effect was like a parallel state. It was linked. You couldn't separate. Nobody could say in those days where the state ceased and where the Church of England began. It was the same. And Charles was under no illusions about that. You remove the bishops. I think his father said that, James. You remove no bishops. He said, no bishops, no king. I think James said that, and Charles took it very much to heart. So in Laud, he had a man of absolute confidence, a man he could trust, a complete dictator, a man with very rigid views, very authoritarian, who was determined to stamp out all opposition in the church, the same as Charles was determined to stamp out all opposition in the state. He wanted everyone to conform to his views of what Anglicanism ought to be, which didn't bear much relation to the original conception that the church had traditionally had. And he introduced a series of reforms and innovations, which, by the way, were complete anathema to the Puritans, to the mass of the population, actually, regarded these innovations with horror. I'll say something about that in a moment. And he ruled with a rod of iron. Anyone that crossed him in any way, the slightest degree, anyone that expressed the slightest opposition or criticism of his reforms would be immediately sent before a council, deprived, stripped of their office, stripped of their bishopric, or removed from the church, if not sent to prison and punished in more severe ways. So that was quite a serious state of affairs. And under Laud, the church was gradually being reverted, if you like, to Roman Catholicism. All of a sudden, the churches became full of stained glass windows and statues and images of the saints, things which the Reformation had done away with. And here was Laud introducing all of these things. Of course, that greatly pleased both the Queen and the King, who was actually suspected, I think rightly so, of strong pro-Catholic tendencies. And there's very little doubt about it that Laud wanted the church to revert, to return to Rome. I think I've got quite an amusing little comment here somewhere. Let me see, where are we now? Oh, first of all, here's an example. This is from the historian David Hume. Bad philosopher, very bad philosopher, not a bad historian from a bourgeois point of view, but there you are. This is a description of how Laud conducted himself inside the church. And I quote, "As he approached the communion table, he made many lowly reverences." He bowed down, in other words. "And coming up to that part of the table where the bread and wine lay, he bowed 7 times no less. After the reading of many prayers, he approached the sacramental elements and gently lifted up the corner of the napkin in which the bread had been placed. Like a theatre, isn't it? When he beheld the bread, he beheld this bit of bread, Christ's body, of course. When he beheld the bread, he suddenly let fall the napkin, flew back a step or two, bowed several times towards the bread, which of course was the body of Christ, made material. And then he drew nigh again, he drew close again, opened the napkin, and bowed as before. He must have had a bad back from so much bowing, I should think. Next, he laid his hand upon the cup, which had a cover upon it, and was filled with wine, communion wine. He let go the cup, fell back, and bowed twice towards it. He must get tired of bowing, this chap. He approached again, and lifting up the cover, peeped into the cup. Seeing the wine, now he sees the wine, seeing the wine, he let fall the cover, started back, and yes, bowed again. Then he received the sacrament and gave it to others. And many prayers being said, the solemnity of the consecration ended. This is the consecration of a cathedral, actually. The walls and floor, the roof and the fabric were then supposed to be sufficiently holy. This, of course, is, if this is different between Roman Catholicism, well, I think you couldn't put a sheet of paper between them. Worse still, he introduced other reforms. For example, the communion table is an important aspect of the Christian service. The communion table, as it was known, was moved from its central position in the nave, but it always used to be, to the east, to the chancery, and surrounded by rails. Moreover, it was no longer called the communion table, but the altar. That, my friends, is pure Roman Catholicism. Absolutely, absolutely. And the priests themselves, he himself dressed magnificently with silks and satin and goodness knows what. The priests also, they wore vestments to separate themselves from the ordinary people and underline their superiority, as a caste of priests. Roman Catholicism, yet again. And this, of course, was this kind of thing was seen with absolute horror by many of the people who were forced to attend church. Don't forget that in those days you had to attend the Anglican church service. No choice in that. You'd be severely punished if you did not. And this kind of thing was viewed with horror. People suspected that Laud, if he wasn't an Arminian like the king, that was in the best of cases. He probably was preparing the way for the Antichrist. That's the way that they would see it. They'd be absolutely horrified by this. And therefore, there was a growth in opposition to Laud and all of his reforms. There was. The resentment against this, you can't underestimate this. The resentment against this movement towards Catholicism, this attempt to change the church, stoked the fires of rebellion. You better believe it was an important element in the future revolution. But there were other elements. Now, Charles, as I said, as you well know, needed cash, needed money, and wasn't too scrupulous about how he was going to get hold of the money. He couldn't impose taxation legally anymore. He dismissed Parliament, and therefore he resorted to illegal taxation. Previously, he tried the forced loan, which at least economically was quite profitable. Now he introduced other measures. All kinds of ancient taxations were revived, such as tonnage and poundage, which is an ancient tax given to the king for emergency purposes, when Parliament couldn't be convened, I suppose, in order to approve it. But Parliament still had to approve this tax. And there was no approval from Parliament because there was no Parliament. Therefore, this was an illegal tax. Other methods he used, for example, if you earn more than, I think, £40 a year, you had to become a knight, Sir so and so, or it was 140, I think it might have been, a certain amount of money anyway. You had to apply to become a knight, which of course was a means of raising cash, a bit like the Roman Empire when you were forced to become a senator and you pay a large amount of money to the emperor, which somebody once cracked that somebody had been exiled into the Senate. So these were all stunts, different means of raising cash. There were many other. The most unpopular of all was ship money. Now, this was not a new tax. This was a well-known tax. It went back to the Middle Ages. And yes, the king did have the right to raise ship money, again, in emergencies, for war purposes, particularly to defend ports against the deprivation of pirates and other raiders from the sea. Each port was supposed to raise a certain amount of cash to pay for warships in order to defend the coastline. Yeah, but Charles not only imposed this ship money without any reason for it, without any emergency. He also, for the first time, and this was an entirely new thing, this was an innovation, he imposed it on every city and town in the land, whether or not they were on the sea. Couldn't be threatened by pirates very well in an inland city, but they all had to pay the ship money, including London and Bristol. All the cities had to pay this tax, which was bitterly resented, and it was opposed. It was opposed. Now, let's be clear on this also. These taxes didn't only affect the rich. They affected everybody. They affected the poor. In fact, the weight of taxation, this is not generally realized, the weight of this taxation fell perhaps most heavily on the poor people, causing a lot of resentment. Brian Manning notes, and I quote, he gives some examples, in the parish of Enfield in Middlesex, a group of young men led the opposition to the ship money in 1638. And their complaint was that the sheriff had altered the assessment so as to ease the burden on the wealthy landowners in the country, forcing it to fall all the more heavily on the young men and farmers. In other words, that's a class question. It fell heavily on the poor. And in this way, as Manning said, thus the middle and poorer sort of people had grievances not only against the government of Charles I, but also against the nobility, gentry, and the richer classes in general. So there's already an element of class war present, and a ferment among the general population, not only the wealthy. He goes on to say this again from Manning. When the subsidy men of Middlesex and Westminster were urged to comply, they answered with a tumultuous shout of a parliament, else no subsidies. Now that's an interesting point. You can see here how the question of the resistance to illegal taxation and the demand for a parliament, democratic revolutionary demand in the context, is beginning to take place. This is already in 1638. There were other reasons. Charles revived or gave extra powers then to the Star Chamber. The court of the Star Chamber was established, I think, under Henry VIII in Tudor times. And it was a court that was entirely under the control of the king, which could inflict the most brutal punishments on any citizen without trial for any offence, real or imaginary. It was above the law, this terrible court of the Star Chamber. And by God, they inflicted punishments. There was a number of cases, but for example, there was a man called William Prynne, very well-known figure at the time. He was a lawyer, a very learned man, and a very courageous man, and a very stubborn and obstinate man, and a devout Puritan who couldn't stomach these reforms. And he wrote repeated pamphlets denouncing them, denouncing the king, denouncing the government, denouncing Laud in particular. One of these pamphlets, is quite a long thing, I think it was about 1,000 pages, can't imagine it, was against, I think, theatres and plays and dancing and music and this kind of thing. He was a Puritan in every sense of the word. And this was taken to be a veiled attack, not so veiled, on the Queen and the King, who of course participated in these things. He was punished, again by the Star Chamber. He was punished by a fine of £5,000. That's a colossal amount of money. How much? I said, that must be several millions of pounds today. £5,000, stripped of all his titles and so on and so forth, dismissed from his work, his job, his profession in the University of Oxford, and also sentenced to have his ears cropped. That was a delightful little method that they had. It cut your ears off. Yes, you could have your ears cut off, your nose slit. I think his nose also was split. You could have your tongue bored with a hot iron. For any offence of, in this case, it was just what we would consider freedom of expression, of publishing a pamphlet, that's all. Yes, he was subject to this barbaric treatment. And then, into the bargain, if that wasn't enough, sentenced to permanent life imprisonment. Imagine that. And even when he was in prison, he still was a courageous man. He still wouldn't give in. He still continued to publish seditious works from his prison cell, for which he was tried again, fined a further £5,000. They couldn't sentence him to any more imprisonment because he was already in prison for life. But there was a little bit of his ears still left. They didn't quite remove all of his ears the first time, and so they made a thorough job. Second time around, they removed all of his ears. Must have been very excruciatingly painful, if you can imagine it. And he was branded on both cheeks with a hot iron, SL, seditious libeller. Yes, that was the kind of treatment that people, not just many people, suffered a similar fate. There were a whole series of people that were well known, considered to be martyrs and heroes, like the minister Alexander Leighton, John Bastwick, a physician, Henry Burton, a clergyman. These were famous cases. They all suffered a similar type of punishment to William Penn. And there's one case I would like to draw your particular attention to. This would have been in 1638, I believe. Just imagine the scene. You're standing in a street in London, and a young man, I don't know, not very old, maybe 20, I don't know, perhaps less, has been sentenced by the Star Chamber for the crime of issuing a pamphlet, a seditious pamphlet, criticizing the king and Laud and so on and so forth. He is sentenced to be dragged through the streets of London, tied behind a cart, and whipped all around the streets of London, from the Fleet prison to the Palace of Westminster. That's quite some kilometres. Savagely whipped. He was whipped and beaten until the blood streamed off his torn back. Must have been in a state of great pain. And he did not give up. All the time he was going along, he continued, if you can believe this, under these terrible, horrific conditions, he continued to distribute the seditious pamphlet to the passersby. And there were many of them. People flocked to see this. Crowds, and that's significant, crowds and crowds of people, ordinary Londoners, lined the streets to see this spectacle, this disgusting spectacle, this savage spectacle. And he continued to do this. He continued in his defiant attitude to eventually collapsed, exhausted. He collapsed. Imagine he was slumped on the pavement, covered in dust and blood. So bad, in such a bad state that even his tormentors felt sorry for him. They began to feel sorry for him, and they said, "Look, for goodness sake, give up, will you? Give up, and just say you're sorry. Just say you're sorry, and this will end." He refused. He refused. And therefore the torment continued until he reached Westminster, where he was put in the pillory. You know, the pillory is this block where your hands and head are inserted into the block, and it's then locked, and you're there. You're left there for hours on end of suffering. And he still continued, even in the pillory, he continued to shout his defiance and preach and harangue the crowds, until eventually the sheriff said, no, we can't have this. They had orders from the Star Chamber, stop his mouth, which they did by cramming a filthy rag into his mouth again. They gagged him, and even then he didn't give up. He expressed his defiance by stamping his feet and gesticulating with his hands. Absolutely defiant. In the end, they decided to put him into prison, and they punished him because they repeatedly offered him, will you relent? Will you repent? Will you give up? He refused. And he was thrown into the worst possible thing. Something he said was worse than the beating that he received. He was thrown into a filthy, dark, disgusting dungeon, and he was left with hardly any food to eat. He nearly died, actually. He said it was far worse to be in that stinking hole. It was far worse than any other torture that they inflicted on him. He was kept there for quite a long time, until eventually he was freed by the revolution. He was freed by the revolution, by the people. The name of this young man, you might have heard of him, was John Lilburne, one of the leaders of the Levellers, a very important component of the revolutionary movement that began to exist at this time. You see, what we must understand here is that on the surface of it, Charles has won. On the surface of it, he's got control. He and Laud and the Queen and Strafford have got the entire kingdom sewn up. And this continued for 11 long years. 11 years of tyranny. Yes. So that's what it seemed like on the surface. And it seemed as if it was going to go on forever. If you've been around at that time, many people would despair. In fact, many people did despair, including Oliver Cromwell. I see this young landowner in East Anglia. Many people emigrated to America. That's where you got the Mayflower and the Pilgrim Fathers. They emigrated as political refugees and religious refugees to practice their religion and their beliefs in a foreign land, a long way away. And Cromwell was considering going to America before the revolution broke out, and then all his plans changed. So it was a very dark period indeed. And yet, despite all the appearances of power and that this was going to continue, this regime was going to continue forever. My friends, it's very often you think that nothing will ever improve, nothing will ever change. We're stuck with these people. We're stuck with the ruling class. We're stuck with the reactionary government and stuff. Stuck by Boris Johnson. Stuck with what's his name across the pond? Can't even remember. Trump, Donald Trump. Yeah, but it's not true. You might have thought in 1917 the Russian people were stuck with the Tsar. They were not. They were not. Or that the French people were stuck with Louis XVI. They were also not. And that was the case here also. Dialectics teaches us that sooner or later things turn into the opposite. Things turn into the opposite. And this was the case here. There's an analogy here with those of you that are acquainted with ancient literature, with Greek tragedy. The Greek tragedy is a very famous part of world literature. And in a Greek tragedy, you always get a tyrant, a central figure. Well, he may be more or less sympathetic, or he may not be. But a central figure with colossal power who rises in a meteoric way till he reaches the peak, reaches the peak of his success. And then precisely at the peak comes the downfall. And in Greek tragedy, the downfall is always brought about by what is known as hubris. It's a Greek word meaning excessive self-confidence, arrogance, if you will. The arrogance of power, if you like. These guys think that they got it all wrapped up and that they have everything under control. They all had that delusion. Yeah, so Laud had that delusion after all. Who could challenge the great Archbishop? You'd end up very badly if you attempted to do so. Or who could challenge the king and the queen? Ditto repito. But no. This hubris was the cause, an important cause of their downfall. They went too far. In the end, they went too far. And King Charles made a bad error of judgment, a very serious error of judgment involving another nation which we have not discussed. We will discuss it next time. That's Scotland. He made a bad mistake when he tried to inflict, he and Laud, in their hubris, in their excessive self-confidence, attempted to impose the same rigid system of church government in Scotland that they successfully imposed in England. Yes, they thought they would get away with it, but they didn't, with very explosive revolutionary consequences, as we shall see.